I want to ask you a personal question. Do you read my newsletter, Leadership Forward 321? Because if you don't, I really think you'd like it if you like this podcast. Every Wednesday morning, I send a short newsletter designed to help you lead your organization more strategically and with less overwhelm in 5 minutes or less. The newsletters are organized around a timely leadership theme and give you something practical that you can apply right away in your organization. I include three of the best articles that I've come across on that theme, two concrete resources or tools that I believe in, and one quote to inspire and motivate you. So if you don't yet get the newsletter, I'm going to make it super easy for you to sign up. Just text the word impact to 66866 and you'll be added to my list. Thanks. Hi, this is the Nonprofit Mastermind podcast, and I'm your host, Brooke Richie-Babbage. Each week, I do a deep dive into the mindset and strategies and tactics and tools of scaling an incredible, high-impact nonprofit. I'm so glad you're here. So about 5 years ago, I began an analysis, like a research project, of the path to growth for small nonprofits. Anybody who's been listening to me for a while knows working with small and growing nonprofits is my happy place. That is what I do. I love the growth phase of things. I love the building part of things. And there is something very unique and exciting about the phase of growth from sort of early six figures to mid seven figures. That the kinds of organizations that you will be as one organization, right? The different iterations that you'll go through just in that growth period are just really interesting to me, really exciting to me. And because I think that so much of what is changing for the better in our society is changing because of organizations at that size. And because I think it's so critical to, those words aren't even strong enough. It's essential that we invest in organizations of that size and make sure that they are strong and sustainable and they don't burn out. That is the only way we are going to fix what is broken in our society. So, okay, that's my rant. So that is why the sustainable growth of small nonprofits under $2 million is a particular passion of mine. And so about 5 years ago, I was invited by a colleague to do some research. She wanted to make a case to her board for a budget that was going to look really different from previous budgets. They had just hit $2 million in revenue, and she wanted to present a true cost growth budget to her board. So some of you have heard me talk about a true cost growth budget before. It is a budget that reflects the actual cost of what growth will look like for your organization, a growth in programs. Very often it's a growth in staff. And so here are a few things that were true about her budget and that can be true about organizations that are also in a growth phase and are crafting and wanting to present true cost growth budgets to their boards. One, the board thought that the budget that she was showing them, that she had shown them so far, was very top heavy. That's what they called it. She was proposing to hire more director level people and to shift money away from sort of what the board saw as executors. Second, the budget looked more operational than it had in the past. It seemed less focused on programs, which is true, it was. And third, and this was probably the kicker, it was just bigger. It's just bigger than they were expecting. You know, they knew that they had hit 2 million. She was actually proposing a little bit over 2 million. And that was scary to them. So she reached out to me because she wanted to know what other organizations her size, right, that were sort of growing from, say, 1.7 to 2 million, what they were doing. What kind of budgets did they have? What did their staff look like? Did they have a lot of director level people? You know, were they just investing in programs? Was she off base, basically? And that's so common. I remember back when I was an executive director, how helpful it was to see behind the curtains of other organizations to get real concrete insight into how other people were doing things, how other executive directors were making choices. Really concrete things like my colleague was asking, how many people do you have on your leadership team and why? How are you paying for health benefits? Where is that money coming from? How are you allocating your budget between operations, which are critical as you grow, and programs, which are the sort of meat and potatoes of our impact, right? So seeing how other people are doing it is really helpful. So I thought I would just do some research and pull together some information, and that would be really helpful, and put together a report. And the specific question at the root of my analysis was basically, what factors should an organization at this stage in its life cycle, right, a small organization that wants to grow, what should it consider if it's interested in growing to and sustaining a higher budget, right? If it's interested in sustainable growth. So it turned out that there is not a lot of information about small nonprofits. While some research really exists exploring the sort of growth strategies of mid-sized organizations, and I'm sort of defining mid-sized organizations as budgets ranging from 5 million to about 10 million. Turns out there's very little information about the strategic and operational shifts made by organizations that are smaller than that. And that's a problem because how you think about fundraising and your board and hiring is so different at 500,000, 1.2 million, and 10 million, just to pick some numbers. Those are very different entities. And so your choices, your decisions are really different. As you may have heard me talk about in my life cycles episodes and posts about the life cycles of a nonprofit and understanding your stage of development, trying to do what organizations at different stages of development are doing is a bad idea. It leads to frustration. It leads to misalignment. It leads to negative self-talk and anxiety for leaders. And believe me, I know, and it leads to burnout. So I found that there was very little information about how, say, a $1 million organization should think about its board, should think about its budget. The guidelines and rules for a larger organization may not be appropriate. And so I just decided to do my own research, which I happen to like. So it wasn't a problem. It was actually a lot of fun. And it kicked off this sort of ongoing project that I've been doing, ongoing collection of data and stories and insight since then to discover and distill whether there's a logic to the seeming. If you sort of read research, it seems like it's sort of chaotic growth of small nonprofits, random and unintentional. So I did a few things. I did a literature review of articles exploring growth levers at different stages of development, did a lot of in-depth interviews with nonprofits, most of them based in New York City initially. And then as COVID has happened and the last 5 years have evolved around the country, that had specifically grown from under 1 million to 2 million in revenue, because I wanted to sort of track these different inflection points, which I'll talk about. I did in-depth interviews with a bunch of foundations that specifically fund smaller organizations to see what they see as trends in growth. And I examined 990's audits and annual reports of similarly situated organizations. So it's been a lot of fun. And I specifically looked at their funding makeup, growth trajectory, staffing and board structure, and the specific strategic and operational changes that they underwent to sustain a bigger budget. So how they grew was important, but I am more interested in how they sustain the budget that the money that they raise, because you can have sort of a windfall, but building the infrastructure to sustain a bigger budget is a very different thing. So that's really what I was looking at. As I've grown my company and my work over the last 5 years, I've worked with over 100 nonprofit leaders under $2 million. And in addition to my more research, I've just paid close attention to these questions of strategic and operational growth. And I've been able to add to and refine my research. So in this episode, I wanted to share some lessons from the field, right? Pull back the curtain in the same way that my colleague was interested in, say, what are other people doing? I wanted to share what I'm learning, what I've learned about what other people are doing, and give insight into what sustainable $2 million organizations look like. So, the first thing that I want to lift up that has been really transformative for me is that although conventional belief about small nonprofits is that their growth is unpredictable and it's random, sort of like throwing spaghetti against the wall, my research does not support that belief. What I actually have found has actually shaped so much of the content that I teach and organize my coaching around inside my next level nonprofit program, all the frameworks that I teach. What I've actually found is that there's a significant number of commonalities, common trends in the strategy and intentionality of small organizations that are trying to grow, particularly in the areas, and these are where I'm going to highlight some of the trends today: staffing structure, how they work with their board, and fundraising. That small nonprofits under $2 million there is a method to the madness of their growth, despite the fact that a lot of research does not focus on that. So that's the first thing I wanted to lift up. If you are a small and growing nonprofit, take heart. You do not have to throw spaghetti against the wall and just sort of hope that your budget gets bigger. There is a way to do it that makes sense. And the other thing that I want to lift up, because it was just very interesting to me, and I think can also be really instructive for organizations that are trying to grow, is that there are these important lines of demarcation in the growth of small nonprofits. They're not just all small, right? They're not just like under 2 million, good luck. That these lines of demarcation seem to happen around 500,000, 1 million, and 2 million. Now, you've probably heard me say, and I actually have training organized around this finding, what got you here won't get you there. It's just a wonderful quote about so many things, and it really applies to nonprofit growth. What I found time and time again is that as an organization passes each of these lines of demarcation, they become different organisms, meaning the strategies and tactics that are required to sustain. And remember, I'm really interested in like what is going to help you stay healthy at a particular size, right? A particular level of budget and impact. The strategies and tactics required for a $1.6 million organization to remain financially stable are different in really important ways than those required by an organization with a budget of $650,000. If an organization tries to use the same staff and the same board and the same fundraising strategies and growth approaches at 650 that are used at 1.6 million, it's going to falter in some way. The staff's going to burn out, the funding's going to plateau. It's not going to work for very long without there being real consequences. Instead, as the organization grows, in order to truly sustain a new budget size, they need to be increasingly intentional about their investment in certain kinds of staff, fundraising, increasing their focus and structure on governance, things like that. Okay, so those are my high-level takeaways. Now I want to share 3 specific trends in 3 core areas as benchmarks for all of you at small organizations out there that are working to grow strategically and sustainably. And like I mentioned, these are specifically trends for organizations that are sustaining budgets of $2 million. Your organization may not be there yet, but I am a firm believer that knowing what the benchmarks of sustainability are at each stage of growth is really important. Before I get into these, if you want to do a deeper dive into growth stages, check out my podcast on the topic where I sort of walk through what they are and how powerful of a framework the nonprofit life cycle framework is. I did that podcast in October of 2021. It's called How to Use Nonprofit Life Cycles to Reflect on the State of Your Organization. And earlier this year, starting in April, I did a multi-part growth series. It's called the Smart Growth Mini Series, all about identifying the benchmarks, the goals, and the challenges at each of the stages of development. So that started in April of 2023. Okay. So first core area, first trend, build a leadership team. So in every instance, literally every instance in my initial research, every single one of the organizations that I interviewed and researched, the organizations had structured a formal leadership team or a team of director level staff people. This often meant, as they were growing, having sometimes tough conversations at the board level about the need to invest in staff and operations in higher salaries instead of direct programs. It sometimes meant hiring fewer people because the salaries for a leadership team or director level team were higher. But without fail, this leadership team was absolutely critical. Those conversations may be tough and the decisions may be tough. I cannot emphasize enough, 100% of the executive directors that I spoke with and interviewed and researched noted the critical importance of having people at a director level to take things off their plate. Now, the specific constellation of leadership staff is different between different organizations. Some have development and operations, some have communications marketing, some have legislative and development. Like there's going to be a different mix. The thing they all had in common was that they were high enough up in the organization's various workflows that they were able to take over management of the internal world of the organization so that the executive director could get out of the weeds and become more external facing. That's the sort of thing to remember. Many of the organizations, many of the executive directors in particular that I have spoken to, over 70% in the last 5 years, have also made a particular point of noting that having a strong leadership team has been a saving grace for their emotional and often physical health. They described almost intangible but very real ways in which having a quality leadership team gave them thought partners to help navigate increasingly tough organizational and strategic decisions, right? Nuanced decisions about how to steward the organization so they didn't feel quite so alone. Having this team gave them people to take ownership of entire areas of work off their shoulders. And this one I thought was really interesting, or I think it's really interesting, but multiple people, dozens of people have noted this independent of one another. Having a leadership team served in many instances as a buffer between them and the rest of the staff. And that this was important when decisions were made that were tough, when there was, a time of flux or change in the organization. Having that buffer felt very important to people. So that's the first trend. This leadership team is critical. The second trend is intentionally construct your funding model. So this is like 2 levels above just being intentional about fundraising, which I talk about all the time. I think that this is like a really interesting trend. So in planning for growth, which I think is important, planning for growth, the organizations that I have researched and spoken to that are sustaining around 2 million, they describe taking a hard or intentional look at their funding model and their history in particular, in order to identify the sources and patterns of income over the past few years. And the reason that I say model is because looking at this relationship between the sources and patterns of revenue is different than just looking at how much money you've brought in. They looked at factors like which areas of funding were growing, which were stagnating, which had the potential to intersect strategically with their programming, which had the potential for earned income, and which had the potential for partnerships, sort of networked growth, nonlinear growth. When you start to look strategically at the nature and sources and patterns of your funding, you're building a model. when you make decisions about leaning in some places, bulking up other places, leaning away, leaning out, letting go, that level of strategic fundraising design is designing a fundraising model. And the reason it's important to think about it as a model is because as organizations get bigger, their funding models will change. So there's a lot of talk about diversification of funding, which is obviously very critical. And so I get a lot of questions from the leaders that I work with about what the right sort of percentages are. I actually have this conversation with a number of funders too, because I do a lot of partnership with foundations to support the capacity building, their sort of capacity building efforts for their grantees. And so this question of say, what should we be shooting for? What percentage should foundations be? What I think is really interesting about this second trend, the intentionality of the construction of a funding model, is that what I actually have found is that at this $2 million demarcation line between 1.5 and 2 million, sort of as organizations get closer to that $2 million mark, the diversification looks really different at every organization. And what they're actually asking themselves is not what should our percentages be in order to be sustainable compared to sort of benchmarks or other organizations. It's what works for our mission, what works for our organization, right? Oh, we actually have deep roots in our community, and grassroots fundraising has been growing and is a significant and stable part of revenue for us. Or we have this fascinating program model that is unique, and we have data that can be monetized for earned revenue. It's a lot more sort of bespoke as organizations get bigger. So that's why I sort of talk about a funding model, because I think it's an interesting next level shift, right? So first line of demarcation, 500K, you really start to see organizations become just more intentional and less organic in their fundraising. They are going to have a specific number of asks every year. They're going to have cultivation events that are unique and tied to their organizations and linked in a meaningful way to the asks. They're going to have more intentional stewardship, right? They're building an actual infrastructure for fundraising. As you near 1 million, you start to have systemization. And as you near 2 million, you start to have this model, right? I'm sort of, that's a really quick and dirty way to say it, but that's the interesting trends there. A few more things about this funding model. As executive directors and their boards had more time to think about fundraising in this more strategic modeled way, a couple interesting things, other sort of sub-trends I noted. One, they tended to move away from funding areas that were not poised for growth, and they built fundraising strategies around those funding areas that had a potential for growth. So they looked at the past, they looked at trends, they looked at their year-over-year financials, and they were really specific and targeted about the questions that they asked with respect to what was working and what wasn't. Second subtrend, for a lot of organizations, this meant a movement away from generalized foundation giving. So at the $1 million demarcation line, and again, I'm hypersimplifying these lines of demarcation for the sake of sort of explication, but at the $1 million mark, there is a really important shift away from program grants. It is very hard to sustain a budget over $1 million made up primarily of restricted foundation money. That is not very stable. It doesn't really work for a very long time. So now we sort of bump up to 2 million. And what we're seeing actually is not just a move away from program grants. I see a move away from a heavy reliance on foundation grants generally. And to the extent that we see foundation grants, they are family foundations. They are the kinds of foundation relationships that are more lasting, they're more personal. They're the ones that you're not necessarily going to find in a database, or that might say, no unsolicited proposals. So they're more relational, and they reflect more the way that you would do sort of individual fundraising. So that's another really interesting trend. A third subtrend in this sort of funding model area is that organizations would break their programs down into component parts. They'd look at staff, curriculum, and outputs, say. And very often they got super granular about assessing how each of those elements could be an asset that could be leveraged for revenue generating purposes within different audiences. So this is what I mean about a funding model. There's like an intentionality here. So for example, an organization that creates public works of art in partnership with other institutions, and this is one of the organizations that I talked to in my initial research, identified ways to increase corporate sponsorship of different stages of the project's development, as opposed to securing sponsorship of an entire project. Because they realized that breaking this down, these different stages appealed to different audiences for different reasons. Two other organizations that I've spoken to more recently realized that their program staff held certain skills that could be leveraged and monetized as training programs for government agencies, right? Expanding their impact, expanding their reach, and building the skills and knowledge, not just thought partnership, but building the skills and knowledge of institutions they wanted to partner with. So that as they're working with government agencies, there's a revenue line for building the skills and competencies, and then they benefit from those increased skills and competencies in stronger, more lasting partnerships. I thought that was fantastic. Okay, third trend, finally, the board. So this is the other area where we see real intentionality as small nonprofits grow. Increased systems and processes. Every organization that I spoke with that had a budget 2 million and over, again, sustainable budget, described a process by which their board underwent, and this word came up a lot, intentional professionalization. So I just say increased systems and processes, or structure and formalization, because the word professionalism means different things to different people. It's not about the nature or level of the professionalism of people on the board. This does not mean that and it shouldn't mean that you look for more quote unquote professionals on your board. That is not a factor that is going to be or should be a driver of your sort of growth and what you think makes a good board. And I have lots of other podcasts about that. What they really were getting at is there was an increased formalization of their values, the rules by which they would work together, and their processes. And that increased structure and formalization meant that the board was able to function as a governance partner more effectively. So there were 4 elements that organizations that have like come to the surface in this area within this trend, sort of sub-trends in this increased standardization and systemization of the board to sustain a larger budget. First, the board got better at self-governing. The executive director was not the one running the meetings, setting the agendas, pulling people's teeth to show up. That was a board chair or board officer. The board took responsibility for that. Second, the board engaged in meaningful self-assessments. So it took its own sort of governance and health and functioning seriously. Third, most of the boards instituted standard and explicit methods for maintaining board accountability. This might be a dashboard. Very often it was some kind of formal signed agreement at the beginning of every year, but they, again, took their role as board members seriously. And then finally, fundraising. And I could go on and on about how by fundraising, I do not just mean asking, right? One of the biggest problems we have when we talk with our boards about fundraising is that we say, who do you know and who can you ask? And that is not what I mean when I talk about board fundraising. Board fundraising is about network expansion and cultivation. It is about giving. There's so many things wrapped up in what resource generation means at the board level. But for my point here today, for this benchmark, every board that is sustaining that level of budgeted impact understands its definition of financial health, has defined for itself its fundraising and resource generation goals, and it holds itself accountable to those goals. This shift towards greater systemization and processes also translated into a greater emphasis on board training, internal development, particularly around governance and finance and fundraising. So you see boards doing more intentional board development, board growth work. As a side benefit, a lot of the organizations that I talk to, particularly in this area, have found that as their board members, as they move in this direction, their board members have more confidence. They have more confidence in their skills. And that meant it created a virtuous cycle, right? The more investment they made in their own skills and development, the more confident they were. And so the more they invested, right? The more time and attention, the more apt they were to engage in core board governance functions. So to recap, the 3 trends, benchmarks that I want to lift up for small organizations that are growing and are looking to see what does a sustainable budget, a sustainable infrastructure or organization look like at this sort of last line of demarcation of a small nonprofit, right? As long as I'm small, what am I aiming for? Structured and effective leadership teams so that the executive director can get out of the weeds, an intentional funding model that leans into what's working and away from what isn't, and increased board structure, skill, and focus on governance. Now, as you think about your own growth, keep these 3 benchmarks in mind, either as lighthouses to aim towards or as gut checks to rethink your own structure, to rethink what you're prioritizing and emphasizing on your road to growth. No 2 organizations of any size, but particularly small nonprofits, are the same. But we can learn from one another so that we can shorten the distance and lessen the effort for getting from where we are to the impact that we want to have. I hope this was helpful. Have a great rest of your week, and I'll see you back here next week for more Mastermind. Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of the Nonprofit Mastermind podcast. I always have so much fun doing these episodes. Definitely check out the links to all of the goodies that I mentioned in this episode. You can get that at brookerichiebabbage.com/podcast for the show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode and think that you have a friend or colleague who would also enjoy, I would love if you would leave a review and share. Have a great week.